Hello everyone, today we talk about the county of Hainaut within the Holy Roman Empire, a significant historical region in the Low Countries, with a very complex and well-documented history rooted in its geographical, political and cultural development from Roman times through the medieval period to its incorporation into the Habsburgic Netherlands. For our historical regional series, we come back to Flanders, that at this point counts an adequate amount of videos in its relative playlist. But the county of Hainaut, that again was one of the most important regions in northwestern Europe, named after the river Haine, which flows from east to west, originating in the once forested area between Binche and modern Charleroi, near the Sambre, and emptying to the Scheldt. Hainaut's geographical definition was relatively stable from its earliest medieval records. You understand how strategic this position would be. In fact, in the modern age that today we don't cover, as you know, this would be one of the, also in the contemporary year, think about World War I, one of the most intense battlegrounds in the entire Europe. The Pagos of Hainaut extended south of the Aisne to the Upper Sambre, the Helpe Majeure, Helpe Mineure, and the Avesnes region in the modern French arrondissement of Avesnes-sur-Helpe. It also stretched southwest along the Scheldt as far as the Selle river encompassing Famars. That was the Roman Fanum Martis, so literally like this shrine dedicated to Mars. The Pagos, of course, is the local district, indicating a village in ancient and early medieval times. This was already, as you understand, in Famars, a key religious and administrative center, conferring the regions since Gallo-Roman times with a specific profile. Archaeological evidence indicates that Hainaut, including Avesnes, formed the oldest region of development within the civitas of the Belgic Nervi, with their early capital at Beauvais. That was nothing less than Bagacum, right? The Celtic and Roman settlement. As you know, the Belgians, we will make more videos about them, because I prepared a video about the Nervi, but I said, well, we should talk first about the Wall people, were a Celto-Germanic population in the northeast of, essentially was not really fully, and it was understood as Gaul, but it had some sort of separation from the rest of it, probably the Celtic Gauls. This was also a major Gallo-Roman crossroads, right? As always, the Romans built their cities over the previous centers, in this case, the Celtic Oppida, that, especially thanks to their quite advanced viatic net for the times, facilitated paradoxically the same Roman conquest of these peoples. The northeast was not so developed like the center of Gaul, but it would turn out, in fact, also in later Roman times to provide with an excellent military basis also for the support of the Rhenish legions. Excavations at Beauvais in 2019 revealed a 2nd century AD Roman theater, indicating the cultural significance of Bagacum and its cultural significance within the Nervi's civitas, now Romanized. A 2023 study by the University of Lille, based on inscriptions found at Beauvais, also confirms the theater's capacity of 7,000 spectators, underscoring its role as a regional cultural hub. I would invite you, every time you study about the Gallia Belgica, to give a look at a map of the actual Roman amphitheaters and theaters concentration. It's insane. All right, it's denser than even some Mediterranean or the most Romanized areas. And this suggests actually an important development in classical antiquity. To the south, beyond the Thiérache forest and hills, lay the Pagos and bishopric of Laon, other quite important, later medieval French archbishopric, part of the Roman-era civitas of the Remi, right, that were yet another Belgian tribe, corresponding to the modern department of Aisne. Right, as we will see now, the political geography of Hainaut is relatively complex, and or at least, as you understand here, it's fundamentally a Romance land, and it was essentially part during its feudal evolution of the whole Roman Empire as much as the Kingdom of France. Now, to the southwest, instead, you have the Pagus of Cambrai, positioned where a major Roman road crossed the Scheldt River. That would become the very capital of the Nervese Civitas and later the seat of a medieval bishopric with jurisdiction over Hainaut and Brabant, whose duchy I made a video on. There was a video on the entire medieval history of Brabant. Naturally, these regions border one another, and they therefore also influenced one another politically, ecclesiastically, and more. This closely aligns, by the way, with the modern French arrondissement of Cambrai as well, from this early, ancient even, not just medieval districtuation. This region is in fact often called the Cambrésie. West of Valenciennes, across the Scheldt, lay the Pagus of Osterband, originally part of the Civitas of the Atrebates, with its capital at Arras, that, by the way, hosts, if completed, had it been completed, like what would have been, in fact, the largest cathedral in medieval Europe. This territory was later contested by the counties of Flanders and Hainaut in the Middle Ages. I also made a video, of course, about the county of Flanders proper. The rest of the Atrebates territory formed the medieval county of Artois, typically under Flemish control, at least, with Osterband corresponding to the modern arrondissement of Douai. Naturally, some of this territory was at some point Celtic or Celto-Germanic, then it was Romanized, then it was at some point re-Germanized and then re-Romanized during the Middle Ages. To the north, within the Nervese Civitas, lay the early Pagus of Brabant, stretching between the Scheldt and Dille, including modern Aalst and Brussels, with Hainaut extending into its southern part as well. Archaeological evidence, such as coin finds, confirms cultural connections between Brabant and Hainaut in Roman times, at least what they would become that later on. A 2021 find of a 3rd century AD Roman coin hoard near Mons, containing 150 silver denarii, underscores Hainaut's role in regional trade networks. This was a time in history, by the way, in which the local populations were ever more to treasure their precious metals, so that we tend to archaeologically find, as it's notorious, more of this stuff in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. At some point, these treasures were forgotten because maybe their owners were killed or they were obliged to abandon the territories because of wars, invasions, and so on. But it's a hallmark of this time. There are also lots of legends surrounding this hidden gold, especially migrating. People think about the gold of the Rhine and this notion that, in fact, the various moving confederacies not just would have their own, but would find others when entering the Roman territory. A 2024 really recent excavation report from the University of Ghent details the discovery of a Roman-era trade depot near the same Mont, containing amphorae with traces of olive oil and wine, indicating Hainaut's integration into Mediterranean trade networks. Even though wine was, of course, grown also in Gaul, and even in parts of essentially Germany. East of the Aisne, the Silva Carbonaria marked a significant boundary, essentially the one that would later exist between Neustria and Austrasia. So really an important crossroads of history and cultures, beyond which lay the Civitas Tungrorum and the medieval bishopric of Liège, encompassing modern Charleroi, Namur, and Leuven. The etymology of Hainaut is likely Germanic, derived from the river Aisne and the Germanic avia, akin to the term Gau, used in other Frankish regions like Masaud, though Gau never became prevalent in Hainaut's medieval records. So it took the name after the river in practice, in the Germanic fashion. In the Roman period, Hainaut was largely within the Civitas of the Nervi, as we've seen in the province of Belgica Secunda. As Roman control waned over the region, This came under the administration, first of Childeric I, a Frankish military leader who fought under Roman command in Gaul, north of the Loire. As you know, Childeric was notoriously the father of Clovis I, and his tomb was actually found at the time of Louis XIV, before the ravages of revolution would disperse the finds, with Childeric essentially being buried as a Germanic warrior as much as a Roman soldier. All right, it's very specific emblems of power. We will, if anything, one day dig more into this, but this gives you the dimension in this Belgian reality, the Loire being the boundary, essentially northern Gaul, of how Romanized at least some of the Franks really were in terms especially of hierarchical power and military and imperial delegation. At this point, we are in the 5th century. The Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties that, of course, took over these territories in the following generations maintained many of the Roman districts, establishing counts to govern the various pagi, so the various villages that were forfeited to the various Frankish chieftains, the ones that were not too cumbersome, as basically it's the Merovingian, later Carolingian blood that sees this the highest post as sacred blood, the one of the anointed. At the time of Charlemagne, Hainaut was part of his empire, of course, and under the Carolingians, it was further formalized as a pagus, with early references appearing in documents from the mid-8th century. In fact, in 750 we have the pagus Hainaut, in 771 the Aginaus, in 831 the Hainaut, 843 the Hainaus, 844 the Hainauenses, 847 the Agnuenses, 852 the Hainau proper, 855 Hainau. These are spelled in different ways, first with a Y, then with the I. 870 Pagus Hainaus and Comitatus Hainau as well, 872 Pago Hainau. So again, we have a pretty sort of well enucleated proof of the existence, likely again straightforwardly throughout all the Roman-Germanic period of at least the original pagus from which Hainaut stems. This records primarily from Pepin the Short, Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, Lothar the First and the Second, and Charles the Bald, indicate Hainaut's status as, again, a simple local district, though it was explicitly recognized as a county already by the Treaty of Meersen in 870, during the various Carolingian partitions, when in fact it was granted to the Western Kingdom, all right, the Western Franks. In the early Middle Ages, Hainaut was sometimes referred to within the aforementioned Pagus Fano-Martensis, so the Fanos of Mars, suggesting either an alternative name or a sub-pagus centered on Famar. We don't fully know, but as you understand, in early medieval times, the, let's say, more civic, rationalized districtuation of these locations had partly been blurred, and this is what really starts occurring ever more from the 9th, 10th century, when local seigneuries basically transcend these pagi, especially in the areas where, again, there hadn't been a radically intense Romanization before. We've seen that, of course, there were a lot of theaters here. There was a robust level of Roman settlements and connections, but I would say these areas had also been gradually, let's say, eroded in the last centuries of the empire, and there were at least some of which the Roman traces were more diluted. Not that they weren't important, but it was easier to alter, eminently agrarian horizon, this kind of different lands. The 10th century monk Folkwin noted that Hainaut was a new name for this older Roman designation tied to pre-Christian traditions. The region's history in the 10th century is marked by sparse records of specific counts of Hainaut, witnessing to the gradual seigniorialization, in fact, not much just of a pagus, but of an actual county that was essentially the basis of the Carolingian administration. Normally, the paget could evolve into comitatus, right? So there is not much of a surprise about that, but it's rather the public nature that switches towards sort of the more private one, especially in this heavily sort of feudalizing and more privatized lands of probably also the Frankish heartland at this point, with Hainaut often associated with the powerful Reginarid dynasty, known for their frequent use, in fact, of the name Reginar, and known for that, obviously. Now, the earliest mention of a Reginarid connection comes from the unreliable Dude of Saint-Quentin, who described Reginald I as duke, so literally dukes of Ebeye and Hainaut, involved in a campaign against Rollo of Normandy in Valchera in the late 9th century or early 10th century. Wasn't, we think, already the Duke of Normandy, but here, say, the local historiography is interesting because here the Reginarid count is placed at almost the same level of this Norse pirate, later probably Frankish nobleman. And this is also like the general space of the era. We are in the age of the second invasions. The Low Countries are pretty open to this raids. Actually, Gaul holds up relatively better than it's normally believed. That's why the Norse mostly diverged towards Britain, and when they essentially installed themselves in Gaul, it's because they were essentially subsumed by Western Frankish power. You already can see here some historical rivalries between different sort of more Flemish and Norman eras. The late 14th century Annales Annoniae further claims Reginald I was a count of Mons. So here the quid pro quo is the fact that the title of dukes bestowed on this first Reginarid is not necessarily what it would have fit in the later formalized feudal hierarchy. I mean, at this point, being a dux or a count could even vary within your lifetime, depending on different designation, different offices that the king would appoint you with. So we unfortunately don't know much about this relations with the Western Frankish kings that were just next door, basically, but it's evident that Hainaut had already a certain importance. In fact, here we know that Reginald was also Count of Mons, a title later held by his descendants, so witnessing to a dynastization of power in Locot, though this cannot be confirmed for his personal time. The first contemporary record of a count in Hainaut, named Zegehard, who held a count including Vandre and Hainaut, which is spelled E-S-N-E-U-X, in the Pagus of Liège in 902, and was associated with Lob Abbey and Thau in Hainaut in 908, as well as appearing in documents from 915, 16, 19, and 20. A 908 charter from the Lob Abbey, that was one of the most powerful in the Low Countries, confirms Zegehard's donation of land in Hainaut, indicating, if anything, his administrative control over parts of the region, as presumably, in fact, he has a count himself. The Reginarid's prominence grew in this period of general recovery, also from the second invasions, despite their turbulent history. I mean, locally, especially, as you know, the Western Frankish territories were very much feudally glued in this also constant fights among one another. But that, however, witnessed to the resistance, even of this local, how robust this local seigneuries were in Western Francia. After Lotharingia, including Hainaut, became part of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, predecessor to the Holy Roman Empire, in 925. This happened for different territorial reasons. If anything, we will look better because they're more complicated than they should in a video properly about Lotharingia that we have never made, but I'm ready to prepare one. In any case, the Reginards led a rebellion in 939. We are at the time of Henry the Fowler, right, under Gilbert, son of Reginald I, which was defeated, however, resulting in the same Gilbert's death. Reginald II, that was Gilbert's brother, is named as a Count of Hainaut in the late 11th century work of the Vita of Gerard of Brogne, where he died, I think, at 42 in the early half of the 10th century. So these people were basically born, maybe not in this case. I think he was born just a couple of years later, the death of Charles the Fat, right? But the whole sort of temper of the era was probably informed with Carolingian grandeur and splendors, which was also for St. Henry the Fowler. In any case, even these later sources are relatively questionable in the scan information he can provide, and how did the author of the Vita of Gerard of Brogne in the late 11th century know exactly about this. And probably there was a foundation to that, but unfortunately historiographical development was not overbearingly advanced, especially in areas like the Low Countries. Reginald III Longneck, Reginald II's son, likely held Mons and may have been a Count of Hainaut before his rebellion against the Duke Bruno the Great in 958. We're talking about the Duchy of Lotharingia, at least the Lower Lorraine, which, as we've seen, led to his deposition and exile. You have interesting dynamics already because you have this precocious sort of what would become Flemish spirit of autonomy. There's still an important here. We're looking literally at the single westernmost reality, especially endowed with a significant power. It was in theory, but still pronounced in the same broader Flanders. In the same 958, Godfrey I, Duke of Lower Lorraine, became Count of Hainaut until his death in 964. Right, this witnesses to a switch, right, of dynasty, where the Reginarids were basically taken out. And after Godfrey, there is Count Richet, possibly also Count in Liège, taking over until his death in 972. Now, what is interesting here is, as you understand, these rulers held different titles at a time. Here we have even Dukes of Lorraine, others are Counts of this place, and then another. So we don't know better, but the wood, at least today, we don't have time to go in depth in this stuff, and at some point we'll probably, hopefully, going to do, but that's how complex medieval history is. And just consider that this is the first video, and they know after hundreds of videos about different medieval European regions, so it would never end, really. In 973, the brothers Werner and Reinhold were killed near Mont, fighting Reginald III's sons, Reginald IV and Lambert, who sought to reclaim their father's lands. So there was a coming back of the Reginarids, trying to retake control from unitly a position of local power that could even contend with the Dukes of Lorraine. Also in 973, the Counts Amalric, likely from Valenciennes, mentioned in 953, and Riquitza, possibly Rickwin, brother of Richet, that, as we've seen, was the Count of Liège, likely, appeared in a grant of Crespin Abbey. Right, so randomly, because normally these, of course, this counts, this nobleman, normally, especially at this time in history, were very much about endowing local abbeys, etc. So as a patrimonial strategy in general. So these ecclesiastical centers were more likely to preserve the particular documents, especially the ones that confirmed the donation to them in land. And so this gives you an idea of already the proto, now already feudal system taking place in the High Middle Ages, Low Countries. By 979, Counts Godfrey, called the Captive, and Arnulf of Valenciennes were recorded defending Cambrai, succeeding Riquildo and Amalric. So there was even a power-sharing situation by different noblemen. The Reginarids, which is typical, by the way, of the High Middle Ages, this family regained control of Mont by 998, when Reginald IV ousted Godfrey, though some historians suggest that this occurred between 985 and 1015, likely after 1007, because of different chronologies that now are a bit too complicated to browse. In any case, you see these Reginarids were pretty resilient, courageous. Reginald IV died in 1013, succeeded by his son Reginald V, which makes sense, while his brother Lambert, who became Count of Lorraine, died in battle in the same Hainaut in 1015. So pretty bloody, militarized, brutal, primitive context that tell well, like, these are some of the most sort of chivalric, knightly, feudal places ever. Right, we'll talk more about medieval Flemish warfare and whereabouts, because it's, really want together with northern France, England, parts of some of the most intensely sort of medieval places ever in common feeling. The county of Valenciennes disappeared from historical records after Arnulf's death around 1011. Possibly because it had been absorbed by the County of Flanders, that was to extend to, in fact, a provincial dimension, as it would become one of the most powerful principalities in the Western Frankish kingdom. It already was. So you see something we've seen also in the video about Artois, how some smaller seigneuries were resisting this process of power concentration from the side of the greater sort of principalities around, which was very courageous and obviously giving rise to these bloody feuds. Consider also the distances were pretty short, like in terms of also strategy, logistics, operations. You could easily lead an army at different times, as if you had always your enemy next door watching each other from the window. Now, Reginald V married the granddaughter of Godfrey, known as the Captive, a union accepted by Bishop Gerard of Lorraine, despite their close relation, which in theory would prohibit, there were some 7 steps, depending on also which one, of familial relations within which you could not get married, but exceptions could be made. When Reginald V's son Hermann died without issue in 1051, his widow Riquilde married Baldwin VI, the Count of Flanders, right, uniting Hainaut and Flanders as a consequence for the first time from 1067 to 1071 as a dowry. This would not last in the short term, however, because at Baldwin's death in 1067, while both counties passed to his son Arnulf III, a dynastic dispute led to Arnulf's death at the Battle of Cassel in 1071. That's an important battle. We will see it in some properly military history analysis for our battle series. Among the other things, because of course it was a sum of lots of feuds that the local nobility at some point took to settle business collectively, to facilitate things. And literally, like, that's how eventually some actual power compaction passed through. Robert I, the Frisian, Arnulf's uncle, at that point seized Flanders, while Riquilde, at this point, was still alive. As much as she had brought Hainaut as a dowry, retained its territory, as well as the adjacent Lower Lorraine territories that also belonged to her dowry. To secure Hainaut as an imperial fief, Riquilde and her son Baldwin II attempted to sell their fiefs to Emperor Henry IV, which was interesting because basically she was seemingly continuing this more autonomistic policy. She, at some point, being married, of course, was quite a concern for a widow in a brutal world like that, even when looking at nobiliary rank, but she already had a child. that she wanted to secure, in fact, a full sort of future with like a full succession. So she said, okay, if we pass to the Holy Roman Emperor, as we've seen, Lorraine had historically passed to the Eastern Franks. The Hainaut had essentially resisted the attempts of inclusion, but since she had partially summed this for genealogical reasons, she said, okay, well, if we manage to secure the seigneury within the Holy Roman Empire, it's going to work. The emperor of the time was Henry IV, who wasn't about not to have a very easy time, frankly, in the following decades. Yet he ordered the Prince Bishop of Liège to purchase and return these fiefs as a unified county under Riquilde and the Dukes of Lower Lorraine. In 1071, Imperial Charter from Henry IV confirms the transfer of Hainaut to the Bishopric of Liège, which was a way to sort of accelerate this feudal passage to the empire, specifying the boundaries of Hainaut as including Mons and Valenciennes. So this was already a sizable territory. A 2022 analysis of the University of Leuven of this charter reveals that it also included a clause ensuring the bishopric's right to appoint local clergy, strengthening ecclesiastical control over Hainaut, which was yet another way, especially at this time in the history of the Holy Roman Empire before the explosion, the full explosion of the investiture controversy, a way to unite, in fact, more the properly this territories to delay the public authority, the imperial one, because the church was quite supportive, at least within probably the Eastern Frankish Empire of the emperor. Eventually, the mess happens. We talked about that, essentially the public collapse in Germany after the Concordat of Worms and or during the civil wars that had been sparked by the excommunication of the emperor, with German princes trying to take some of this public right. By the way, this Hainaut unification with East, completed in 1071, merged the county of Mons, the southern part of the Pagus of Brabant even, and the Ottonian Margraviate of Valenciennes. Right? So this literally, because there was an Ottonian Margraviate of Valenciennes, at this point, as you understand, there were the Salians as well, so we can't see everything at the same time, but all these territories were congregated, and they had also, as we've seen, a sort of military frontier character, such as the monarchs would normally were. There was Ostrabant extending Hainaut to the Scheldt left bank even. Hainaut's counts, particularly the Reginarids, frequently clashed with the dukes of Lorraine, as we've seen, and the bishops of Liège and Cambrai, representing imperial authority as they expanded from their base in Mons to form an autonomous territorial principality. And so paradoxically, this was reverted. The rivalry with Flanders and concerns about also Brabant's growing power, as we've seen, because that was to become the most powerful Flemish polity, led them to eventually switch to properly instead the full properly Holy Roman Imperial side. As we've seen in 1071, this infeudation to the Imperial Church of Liège. Baldwin V of Hainaut is an important figure in the country's history in the second half of the 12th century, ruled between 1171 and 1195. He was quite an important figure, representative of the same Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in the Low Countries. For this, he secured the Margraviate of Namur, and after the death of his brother-in-law, Philip of Alsace, one of the greatest knights of his time, who also schooled Henry the Young Prince, by the way, in the arts of war, an organizer of tournaments, and also, a veteran of the wars against the Lombard League, reunited Hainaut and Flanders in 1191. I also made a video about from duchy to dukedom, looking at Lorraine, like we're talking about now, feudally, and Swabia during the reign of Frederick Barbarossa, that illustrates how and why these specific figures were receiving on the northwestern frontier such great decentralized power, because essentially these areas were not, they were rapidly expanding as we've seen, but they had missed in Lotharingia solid stattal tradition. And so basically in order to maintain power in them, also because you were also located in quite strategical places as far as trade and commerce were concerned, were co-opted especially by the emperors, who had the power to confer, in fact, more personal power. In fact, the title of that video means essentially the passage from an idea of duchy as some sort of almost ethnic, like district, to some sort of feudal power wielded by a single nobleman in this imperial optation mechanism. In fact, in the very early 90s, also because, or at least the very late 80s, because Barbarossa died exactly in the Crusade in 1190, a diploma from the Holy Roman Emperor officially recognized Baldwin V's acquisition of the Margraviate of Namur, detailing his role as imperial representative. Baldwin V, by the way, was nicknamed the Courageous. Here we're talking again some of the most probably knightly cultures ever. Baldwin had been present at the Diet of Mainz, had being conferred probably an imperial sword by Barbarossa. I mean, we're talking, and there is all level of, again, power conferment that we will have to deal in our videos about knightly ideology and more, because there were also incredibly traditional principles of imperial enfeoffment of power conferment. It's incredibly meaningful that these men were chosen for this. And a 2023 publication of this diploma by the University of Heidelberg confirms that this diploma also granted Baldwin V tax exemptions for Namur's markets, boosting its economy integration with Hainaut, and therefore conferring more power to this individual. And this union persisted essentially until 1246. It was facilitated also by Baldwin V's marriage to Margaret, that was the heiress of Flanders. So you understand also genealogically here things were not going too far, at least for power concentration of all these territories. So we're talking the high nobility of Europe at this point. In 1169, that's when the marriage was celebrated, making, by the way, in this fashion, also Baldwin V, Baldwin VIII of Flanders as well, was a Count of Flanders himself. So imagine the complication, imagine changing coat of arms in the process with your former enemies, really crazy times even just in a psychological sense, a world that we're completely de-habituated to in everything, right? We would be incredibly surprised by. During his reign, Hainaut and Namur were also united. And Baldwin the /9th, the son of Baldwin the /8th, and Margaret, became also, and you know that, the first emperor of the Latin Empire of Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, right? So we're looking at really that specific world, marking the start of French influence in Hainaut, however. Philip, for example, Baldwin V had been very much connected with Philip Augustus. It was, as you know, brutally re-expanding Capetian power to an unprecedented degree. And there was a lot of negotiation to preserve this autonomous power in between France and Germany, so to say. Those years were also the ones following the Second Crusade. The French and the Germans did not like very much each other. This is also the age of Bouvines, with, if you look at that, 1204, 1214. I recently made videos about this, talking about the same Count Ferdinand of Portugal, who was captured by Bouvines from the Allied side. Why? Because this guy was the husband of Baldwin's daughter, Joan. And as we were just saying, he was defeated by Philip Augustus at Bouvines in 1214. So in the process, because Joan was the only heiress at this point of this impressive sum of fiefs. Baldwin's brother Philip I of Namur served as regent in Hainaut. But it wasn't an easy situation, because Bouvines had really shattered much of the political and strategic balance of the house. And in fact, there were wars with the Luxembourg over Namur. Never made a bit about. Hainaut was essentially an agricultural region, right? As it's a broader Flemish one, if you can say, within the broader frontier. At least in the Low Countries, you can see some more of industrialized areas, such as Flanders, with some of the most important trade, say the hubs, but also textile production in medieval Europe with Ypres, Ghent, Brugge. Was much more sort of rurally feudal. Right, doesn't mean less powerful, because there were lots of castles, and as we've seen, there was in general a very deep intertwinement, probably with the greatest powers in Europe. It had, however, also some textile production in the Middle Ages flourishing, with the cloth industry of Valenciennes, right, which gained urban autonomy through a charter granted by Baldwin II in 1114, which is fairly early, and aligning chronologically with the other Flemish cities. A 12th century textile guild charter from the same city, discovered in 2020, details regulations for cloth production, confirming its economic prominence. And a last year study by the University of Brussels notes that this charter also specified quality standards for woolen cloth, ensuring Valenciennes' competitiveness in European markets. Right, there was a level of standard that had to basically work for the entire city, so that a bit like the mint, etc. Like, if people knew that you were reliable, that quality was uniform, and you could trust the imports from there, as far as the Count of Flanders is concerned, because they would remain basically counts throughout some of the most important times in the 13th and 14th century in Flemish history. Goes to this less powerful house. Margaret's death in 1280, by the way, ended the Hainaut-Flanders union, because this lasted until probably Margaret's life. Jean of Avesnes founded a new line of Hainaut counts. He died before his mother in 1257. His son, Jean II, became Count of Holland and Zeeland at the same time, where at the very end of the 13th century, through his mother, so Jean, the first wife. This situation brought him, by the way, to ally himself with Philip IV of France against Flanders, because, as you know, Philip the Fair invaded Flanders, ruled by the Dampierre house, and the result of the Battle of Courtrai. I made multiple videos about that. We talked about Flemish warfare, and as you know, the Battle of the Golden Spurs is such a pivotal time, which evidently didn't go in favor of Philip's allies, at least in the moment, because it's not like the Flemish eventually won. And so this situation was, however, a bit complicated by the fact that Hainaut was not quite in this situation fully in the hands of Jean II. He unsuccessfully claimed its countship, but ruling it was something else. The Avesnes counts were, however, notable allies of Hainaut in the early 100 Years' War with William I, 1304, 1337, Jean II's son, serving as a key agent for Edward III of England and hosting a chivalric court in Mons. So they basically passed from the other side, understanding what potential lay, at least in a temporary decentralization of Flanders, just for the sake of their own house, because Flanders got destroyed in the process and would be taken over, as we'll see now, by the Valois Burgundy. By the way, this we have seen in the video about Jean Froissart, the most important medieval French chronicler, even though he was actually Flemish, inasmuch William patronized this chronicler. And as we've seen, Froissart was exactly from this borderland area of Flanders with France, and he would become one of the most important voices in medieval history. A 1334 letter from Edward III to William I of Hainaut, preserved in the English National Archives, requests military support to the latter for campaigns in France, highlighting Hainaut's strategic role during the early phase of the 100 Years' War. William's daughters, Philippa and Margaret, the latter married to Emperor Louis of Bavaria, by the way, Ludwig the Bavarian, spread this culture to London and Munich. Right, These courts were, as we've seen, quite feudally magnificent. They still got it at those levels, and they were also pretty sizable. By the way, as we will see now, the later Middle Ages will favor some broader agglutination of these feudal states. After the Avesnes line ended in 1345, the Wittelsbach dynasty, through Margaret's marriage with, as we've seen, Ludwig the Bavarian, inherited Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland, or Zeeland if you prefer, and Bavaria Straubing. Right. I'm preparing, by the way, a video about the medieval Rhenish Palatinate, which also pretty fits with this picture, because the Wittelsbachs were sort of expanding, branching far and wide, even though they had, just like the Habsburgs, literally different branches. In fact, did not quite reunite, but they were, of course, a hell of a princely and actually imperial dynasty at this point. The Wittelsbachs faced, as we were saying, internal strife during the Hook and Cod Wars that we have discussed in the video about the County of Holland. These were some factions within this province that were aligned with different policies, especially involving the Hanseatic League and the different relations with England, with France, with these other powers. Now, but these, say, the Wittelsbach name is just, again, they're literally, as traditionally, some rulers that are grafted and implanted into these faraway lands that do not have too much to do with Bavaria at this point, exactly because they're sort of autonomous branches. After Duke William II, here we're reasoning numerically by Hainaut ruler, like, of course, William II's death in 1417, his daughter Jacqueline inherited Hainaut, but faced opposition from her cousin Philip the Good of Burgundy. You can imagine how things end on the longer run. In fact, by 1428, Philip gained effective control of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland, and in 1432, Jacqueline ceded her inheritance rights to him. Right? They really want to go against the Valois Burgundy. It's not prudent in general. Jacqueline died on October the 8th, 1436, likely of tuberculosis, a dreadfully, common way of passing at the time. She died at Tellingen Castle near The Hague, where she is in fact buried, and her estates were incorporated into the Burgundian Netherlands under the House of Valois-Burgundy, which also held Flanders, Artois, Namur, Franche-Comté, and later Brabant, Limburg, and Luxembourg. Right? We made, I already told you, Flanders, Artois, Brabant, and we really miss Namur, Franche-Comté, Limburg, and Luxembourg. But again, let's not put limits to Providence. Hainaut was essentially an agricultural region, right? As a broader Flemish one, if you can say, within the broader frontier, at least in the Low Countries, you can see some more of industrialized areas such as Flanders, with some of the most important trade, say the hubs, but also textile production in medieval Europe with Ypres, Ghent, Brugge. Hainaut was much more sort of rurally feudal, right? Doesn't mean less powerful, because there were lots of castles, and as we've seen, there was in general a very deep intertwinement, probably with the greatest powers in Europe. It had, however, also some textile production in the Middle Ages flourishing, with the cloth industry of Valenciennes, right, which gained urban autonomy through a charter granted by Baldwin II in 1114, which is fairly early, and aligning chronologically with the other Flemish cities. A 12th century textile guild charter from the same city, discovered in 2020, details regulations for cloth production, confirming its economic prominence. In a last year study by the University of Brussels notes that this charter also specified quality standards for woolen cloth, ensuring Valenciennes' competitiveness in European markets. Right, there was a level of standard that had to basically work for the entire city, so that a bit like the mint, etc. Like if people knew that you were reliable, that quality was uniform, and you could trust the imports from there. This system mostly flourished in the following couple of centuries. Then also in Valenciennes, the 14th century would witness an important crisis for also different sort of socio-economical disruption at different levels. So you understand this broader feudal intricacy that, however, dominates the political landscape of medieval Hainaut. The region's history reflects multiple personal unions, including with Flanders, that, as we've seen, last from 1067 to 1071 and from 1191 to 1246, which is never like it's a dynastic collection more than a union. At least a union, yes, understood in a feudal sense, not in a annexation, in a merging. Holland between 1299 and 1436, and Bavaria Straubing 1356-1417. After Charles the Bold's death at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, as it's notorious, the main line of the Burgundian dukes ended. Right, so the so-called Burgundian states that I also made a video on, detailing, in fact, the history of, say, at least the gradual Valois-Burgundy takeover of these various territories in Flanders. The entire system sort of collapsed, right? The North Flanders basically passed through Charles the Bold's daughter Mary in the hands of the Archduke Maximilian I of Habsburg, her husband, and son of the Emperor Frederick III. All right, so that part, together with Hainaut, will be transferred essentially to the Habsburgs, nominally as rulers of the Holy Roman Empire and later Spain. The rest of the Burgundian states, essentially the Duchy of Burgundy, was in different other. For example, there were some disputes also there with the Holy Roman Empire, but were essentially taken over by France, who basically made it a territory of the crown. I also made a video, of course, about the Duchy of Burgundy proper, besides the Burgundian states. Louis XI of France, hoping to exploit Charles' death, not just took over militarily the Duchy of Burgundy, because that's what he chose. Like, he could have tried, for example, a French marriage for Mary, right, with some Capetian Valois noblemen. But that would have taken time, because, as you've understood in this parts of sort of European power succession, the woman would have maintained her inheritance until her death. That's what happened also with Anne of Bretagne. Brittany followed, in fact, that sort of longer path before being properly seized by France. So Louis XI acted reasonably and took over the Duchy of Burgundy, was quite successful. But as far as Flanders, things went a bit of a different direction. In fact, Louis invaded the Netherlands, but was defeated at the Battle of Guinegate in 1479, which was also like the first kind of half victory that the Flemish managed to achieve since the time of Montpellier at the beginning of the 14th century, because up to that point they had beaten out of themselves by the Valois Burgundy also proof that how the infantry won the commutes. If you know how to defeat the cavalry, all this mechanistic nonsense that people believe, like in later Middle Ages, infantry became strong. No, right? The Valois Burgundian, their feudal armies literally paved, wiped the floor out of the Flemish infantry throughout the entire time. And here at the Battle of Guinegate, by the way, the success came mostly from the Habsburgic side, because Maximilian had taken care of instructing some Flemish troops in the Swiss fashion with some Swiss advisors, but the Flemish didn't even want probably to pay for a modern pike-based army. And so also they remained a sort of a backwater in the broader international situation. But the French were at least bogged down, as it would happen repeatedly in the following centuries, in the Low Countries. And so with the Treaty of Arras, famously enough, in 1482, all those territories of the Habsburgic Netherlands, together with Hainaut among them, marked the latter's integration into a political entity until its transformation in the Département of Jemappes in 1795. During the French Revolution, naturally, were pretty far away times, but we appreciate at least the fact that we can, at some point, even use this as a handle for future, also probably modern history series about these polities, because, again, some of you asked me once and never really taken this into consideration, but I think that we can maybe start to do so. I'm really starting to do a lot of stuff, and some of you would think that it's dispersive. Most of you want me to stick to the Middle Ages as much as I can. But you see, it's just a great flow, right, of this history that really never ends in so many different ways, and therefore what are we looking at? As I was saying at the beginning of the video, I'm glad that we have made so much videos about medieval Flanders, because it always passes as if, we didn't do enough, and because these areas are not cohesive, and so it seems as if they were simply more anonymous in the picture. But actually on Schwerpunkt, this is our 14th video about Flanders, right? And this accomplished the level of relative fragmentation that accompanies them, and so all these various powers that fundamentally emerge from that. And it's not like we've done even too much, aside from some videos about medieval Flemish warfare that naturally were welcome, and some other sort of focused videos on mostly like the socio-economical collapse of Flemish trade in the 14th century. There is else, of course, something comparative with Germany and Flanders at the time of the Golden Bull, the aforementioned video about Jean Froissart, but we have made so far just County of Flanders, medieval Brabant, the County of Artois, the County of Holland, and a city, medieval Brugge, right? Which, again, is interesting. Also, the cities series obviously is dominated by the Italian city-states, but of course I've been expanding, and we will keep covering similar topics. So we really need, telling the truth, to do more. We should bring this at least to 20 videos for saying that we have decently covered medieval Flanders as a starter, as a sort of launching pad for future content. On the other hand, again, more will come. I have a medieval Brabançon scheduled video. This is not just about Flanders, telling the truth. It talks about their service, in fact, mostly in France, under different powers, especially during the main clashes between the Angevins and the Capetians, which is also a topic, by the way, that some of you has asked me more consistently. And we will, in fact, layer this Flemish history, in fact, with all this other stuff, because I have, especially from the cycle, a greater amount, as I was saying before, of sort of English, French, Flemish, part of German warfare, mostly concentrated in that sort of more fully feudal background that we mostly and stereotypically intend the Middle Ages as in this corner of northwestern Europe, of which indeed Flanders were a quite interesting piece. For the rest, again, we have a remarkably large amount of videos on different topics, some of which are also sometimes making us think, how the hell do we actually make all this stuff? But we are succeeding. We are succeeding, and I'm again very glad about this. This is the level of production we should have had since the beginning of the channel. At that point, we already have hundreds of thousands of views, but that's also how I learned, how I improved over time. And again, if anything, we will see things better throughout their evolution. All right. What else to say? In general, we're getting... okay, let's not talk about the channel trends, because they are always something that said not to skip, but generally speaking, August is never the best month, right? So September is generally the best month, but I'm skeptical that we're going to rise by scale once again. We're mostly just remaining where we are with a constant flow, but one that we could really improve, because really, I don't know what's with this channel. I don't know how many other videos are made about this topics, who searches for them, what kind of sharing there is. Here, looking at the analytics, they also changed the whole kind of system of factors, etc. This is not so. Never really fully understood how to make this, but we are not having an enormous deal of external views. All right, those more or less remain the same, and it's absolutely fine. Say traffic. Let's see. External. Oh, finally we found it. It's how messy that this is. It doesn't make any sense. Overall, it's not really that much. It's very low, actually incredibly low amount of external views, right? And it's so weird also because you keep seeing this, for example, in the last month, 69 views from the Roman army sound signals and musical instruments. Yeah, okay, tuba, cornu, buki, nalitus, but really, is this the best? We can offer it. It's sort of weird. This sharing mechanism is broken. It's not like my videos are not interesting to people, because believe me or not, I see out there is some terrible stuff that is very much more watched and doesn't make any sense. But if we don't share en masse, like we could make tens of thousands of subscribers overnight, if even just ideally 1/10 of all the subscribers did something a day. We're still not there. It's such a waste. All right, let's do something more. It's really important. It is really for the type of topics that we cover, and you know that. In any case, this historical original series is somehow appreciated, so let's at least trick a bit the people. If the algorithm was what they want, let's try to at least stick to what also works. Not only because we need to talk about everything, but still. Very well, anyhow, let's never complain, just per se. For today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.